I have known Gerard Ashworth, the 9th Duke of Hollowmere, since we were boys of 9 and 10, tearing our stockings on the same hedgerows and inventing the same absurd wars against the same imaginary enemies. And I will tell you plainly that in all the 40 years since, I never saw him look as he looked on the afternoon. We stood together in Pharaoh's bookshop on Cheapside, and he read a woman's name off the spine of a small green volume, as though the letters themselves had struck him across the face. But I am ahead of myself, and an old man ought to know better than to begin a story in the middle of it, even when the middle is the part that undoes him. Let me go back, as I have gone back so many times in the retelling, to the library at Hollowmere, on a wet November evening some 11 years before that afternoon in the shop, when I was not present but heard the account so many times afterward, from so many angles, that I have come to feel I was standing in the doorway myself, holding my breath. It was the year the estate very nearly went under. I need not trouble you with all the particulars of shipping contracts and continental creditors, and the tangle of French and Italian correspondence that governed the Hollowmere fortunes in those years, except to say that the Duke's holdings were bound up, more than was wise, in agreements with merchant houses in Lisbon and Marseille, and that the whole of it depended on documents that had to be read, understood, and answered correctly, in languages the Duke himself did not command with any fluency. For that work, for nearly 6 years by the time of which I speak, he had depended on a young woman named Eleanor Vane. She had come to Hollowmere as a girl of 22, the orphaned daughter of a country parson who had, in a fit of eccentric generosity uncommon among country parsons, taught his only child Latin, French, and Italian alongside her catechism, and left her, upon his death, with nothing but that education and a very small annuity that would not have kept her in coal through a single winter. She answered an advertisement for a secretary competent in foreign correspondence, expecting, I imagine, to be turned away for her sex before she had finished her interview. Instead, she was hired within the hour, because the steward who first spoke with her recognized, within 3 sentences of her translating a difficult Italian shipping manifest aloud, that here was competence not to be found twice. For 6 years she sat in a small room off the estate library, transcribing, translating, drafting responses that the Duke signed as his own, untangling contracts that would have taken a lesser mind a fortnight to make sense of in a single evening. She was, in every particular that mattered to the running of Hollowmere, indispensable. She was also, in every document that left the house, invisible. Her name appeared on nothing. The letters went out under the Duke's seal, the translations were folded into ledgers under a steward's initials, and Eleanor Vane's name existed only on the household wage book, in a hand not her own. I do not say this to condemn Gerard entirely, not yet. It was the custom of the age, and no great scandal was made of it by anyone, least of all by her, who understood the arrangement when she accepted it and made no complaint that I ever heard of. She was a proud woman in the best sense of that word, proud of her work, not of her position, which she never expected to be more than what it was. But I set it down because it matters to what came after, and because I think Gerard himself did not fully understand, until many years too late, what he had asked of her all that time, and what it had cost her to give it so well and so silently. The crisis came in November, as I have said, when a shipment of Hollowmere wool bound for a Marseille merchant house was refused at the dock over a contract clause that the merchant claimed had been altered from the terms originally agreed. A clause concerning payment terms that, in the French draft returned to Hollowmere, specified 90 days where the English understanding had always been 60. The difference over the volume in question was several £1,000s, and worse, it threw into doubt the good faith of every other contract Hollowmere held with continental houses that season, at the exact moment when 2 of the estate's English creditors were pressing hard for repayment of loans taken against the harvest. Gerard was, that autumn, a man under a siege he had not chosen and could not entirely see the shape of. I visited him twice in October and found him thinner both times, sharper in his speech, sleeping badly by his own admission. He was 31 years old and had held the title only 4 years, inheriting an estate already strained by his father's mismanagement, and he carried, I think, a private terror that he would be the Ashworth who lost what 6 generations had built. A man in that condition is not always just. He is not always kind, and on the evening the news of the Marseille contract reached him, he was neither. He called Eleanor to the library. I have this from her own account, given to me years later with more composure than I could have managed in her place, and I have no reason to doubt a word of it, for she was not a woman given to embellishment even in her own favor. He held the French draft in one hand and the English correspondence book in the other, and he asked her, without preamble, whether she had translated the payment clause in the draft that had gone to Marseille. She said that she had. He asked her how a woman who had sat in his library for 6 years, who he had trusted with the whole of his foreign correspondence, could have rendered succincte as 90, could have made an error of that magnitude at the one moment it could least be afforded, could have cost him. And here, I am told, his voice rose in a way it rarely did, for he was not a shouting man by temperament, only a controlled one whose control had that night entirely deserted him. Could have cost him everything his family had built across 200 years, through carelessness, through simple incompetence, when competence was the entire and only reason she had ever been kept in his house. She told him quietly that she had made no such error, that she had translated the clause correctly as 60 days, and that she still had her working copy of the translation to prove it, in her own hand, dated the week before the draft went out. He did not ask to see it. That is the detail that has always seemed to me the cruelest part of the whole affair, crueler even than what he said next. Not that he doubted her, men under that kind of pressure will doubt anyone, but that he did not trouble himself to look at the proof she offered him, standing not 3 feet away before he condemned her. He told her that he had no more use for a secretary whose word could not be trusted where it counted most, that 6 years of service did not purchase the right to ruin him in a 7th, and that she would leave his employment within the week. And then, and I set this down only because you must understand the full weight of what she carried away with her, and what he later had to carry alone. He said that he had always known there was a risk in trusting matters of such consequence to a woman, that he had overlooked it because her work had seemed equal to a man's, and that he now saw he had been a fool to overlook it even once. She did not weep. She did not argue further, though she might have insisted, might have demanded he examine her working papers there and then, might have raised her own voice to match his. She told me once, long afterward, that she had understood in that moment that no argument she made would be heard over the sound of his own fear, that a man so far gone in panic does not listen. He only waits for silence in which to be angrier still, and that she would not give him the satisfaction of watching her plead for what was, in any case, already lost. So she inclined her head, said that she understood, and left the library with what dignity a person can carry out of a room where they have just been called both incompetent and something worse for the crime of being a woman who had done her work superbly for 6 years. She was gone from Hollowmere within 4 days, having given notice to the housekeeper, packed the whole of her belongings into 2 trunks that a carter took to the village, and drawn from the small savings she had accumulated, for she had been thrifty as well as brilliant, and had put by nearly all her wages against exactly such a reversal of fortune, though she had never imagined the reversal would come from this quarter. Enough to secure a single room in London, and 6 months of very careful living while she sought other work. She left no note of reproach. She asked no one at Hollowmere to speak on her behalf, though I am told the housekeeper wept, and the steward who had first hired her was heard to say it was a black day's work and no mistake. She simply walked out to the carter's cart on a gray morning with her 2 trunks and did not look back at the house, and that, I think, more than anything she might have said, was the beginning of everything that came after, because a woman who walks away like that, without a scene, without begging, carries her dignity with her wherever she goes next. And dignity, once a person has proven she will not surrender it even at the point of ruin, has a way of compounding like interest across the years. It was 3 weeks after her departure that the truth came to light, and it came to light by accident, as such things often do, and far too late to undo what had been done. The steward who managed the Hollowmere accounts in matters of shipping and contract, a man named Josiah Red, who had been with the estate a decade, and whom Gerard trusted implicitly, more fool he, as it turned out, had for some months been quietly diverting a portion of the estate's shipping commissions into arrangements of his own with a rival house in Marseille, a scheme that depended on the original Hollowmere contract failing to hold. Red had altered the payment clause himself, after a lingers translation left her hands, and before it was copied into the final draft for sealing, changing 60 to 90 in a hand close enough to the clerks that it passed unremarked, and had done so precisely because he knew that if the contract collapsed under suspicion of a translation error, the blame would fall first and hardest upon the one person in the household without power to defend herself against it. It was discovered when a second clerk, cross-checking the ledgers after the Marseille house lodged a formal complaint, found Eliner's original working copy, the very paper she had offered Gerard, and which he had not troubled to examine, still filed among her effects left behind in the library desk, and saw that it did not match the sealed draft at all, that someone had altered the figure after her hand had already done its work correctly. Red, confronted, first denied it, and then, when the ledgers of his private dealings were produced, fled the county within the week rather than face a magistrate, and was never, to my knowledge, seen in England again. Gerard told me of it himself, some months later, over a bottle of port neither of us finished, and I have never in our long friendship seen a man look so entirely undone by his own conduct. He said he had gone that same night to write to her, to the direction the housekeeper had for her lodgings, to confess the error and beg her to return, and that the letter had come back to him unopened, marked simply removed, no forwarding address given. She had, within weeks of leaving Hollowmere, given up even that first London room for something else, something he could not trace, and whatever pride had carried her out of his library dry-eyed had evidently carried her a good deal further than a single address could follow. He did not stop trying, not entirely, not for a year or more. He made inquiries through the sort of channels a duke can make inquiries through, solicitors, an old acquaintance at the Foreign Office who might know of translators seeking work, even, in a fit of something close to desperation, an advertisement placed in a manner vague enough not to embarrass her should she see it, asking any translator formerly of Hollowmere to write to him regarding a matter of back wages owed. Nothing came of any of it. She had gone, as thoroughly as a person of modest means and considerable resourcefulness can go, and after the second year he stopped searching in any active way, though I do not believe he ever stopped thinking of it, in the way a man thinks of a debt he knows he can never repay because he does not know to whom. I want to be fair to him here, because it would be easy in the telling to make him out a villain redeemed only by a chance encounter in a bookshop, and that is not the whole truth of the man. He was, in the years that followed, changed by what had happened, not loudly, not in any way that made a show of contrition, for he was not a man who performed his feelings for an audience, but in the quieter architecture of how he ran his house and treated those who served him. He instituted, without ever explaining why to anyone who worked under him, a standing rule that no servant or clerk of Hollowmere was ever again to be dismissed on an accusation without the accused first being heard in full, and any evidence they held being examined before judgment was passed. He was patient with his staff in a way he had not troubled to be before, slower to anger, quicker to ask a question before delivering a verdict. 2 separate housekeepers over the following decade told me, without any prompting on my part, that the Duke of Hollowmere was, whatever his reputation for sternness in society, scrupulously fair to those under his own roof, more so than most men of his rank troubled to be. I believe, though he never said it to me in so many words, that every ounce of that fairness was penance for a single evening in a library, and for a woman he had wronged and could not find to make it right. He did not marry in all those years, though he was a duke of considerable property, and there was no shortage of mothers in London willing to present their daughters to him. He gave, when pressed by his aunt or by well-meaning friends, the excuse that the estate required his full attention, which was true enough as far as it went, but I knew him too well to think it the whole reason. A man does not carry a woman's name half-spoken on his conscience for a decade because the estate requires his attention. He carries her because something in him has not finished its business with her, whether or not he would ever have named it so plainly, even to himself. And so we come at last back to the bookshop. It was a Tuesday in early spring, and I had persuaded Gerard, who was in town on some tedious matter of parliamentary committee business, to accompany me to Pharaoh's, a shop I had frequented for 30 years for its excellent stock of foreign literature in translation, a small vice of mine that he had always found amusing, since he claimed no patience for reading anything that was not a ledger or a newspaper. He came along that day only because I had promised him luncheon afterward at his club, and he stood by the window with the particular restless boredom of a man who considers browsing a bookshop a species of mild torture, while I made my slow way along the shelves. It was he, not I, who first picked up the volume. I have turned this over in my mind many times since, the strange justice of it, that it should have been his own hand that found her, when I had walked past that same shelf twice without noticing anything at all. He told me afterward that it was only the color of the binding that caught his eye, a deep, plain green with simple gilt lettering, nothing showy, the kind of modest, well-made book a serious scholarly press produces for readers who care more for the contents than the display. He picked it up, I think, from nothing more than idle habit, the way a man will pick up any object near to hand while his mind is elsewhere, and he turned it to read the spine. I was 3 feet away and did not see his face change. I only heard him say, in a voice entirely unlike his usual composed tone, a single word "Eleanor," and when I turned, he was standing quite still with the book open in both hands, staring at the title page as though it might vanish if he blinked. I came to his side and looked over his shoulder. The book was a translation from the Italian of a slim volume of essays and letters by a minor but genuinely fine 18th-century Neapolitan writer, the sort of thing perhaps 400 people in London would ever trouble to read, but beautifully done, the introduction alone showing a scholar's command of both languages and a translator's ear for English cadence that few men trained at university ever achieved, let alone a woman working without any institution behind her at all. And beneath the title, in the same simple gilt lettering as the spine, was printed, translated from the Italian, with an introduction and notes, by Eleanor Vane. Not Miss Vane, secretary, not a name folded into someone else's ledger. Her own name, entire, on the first page of a book that would sit on shelves in shops like this one for as long as the paper held together. Gerard did not speak for what felt to me a very long moment, though I suppose it was no more than half a minute. Then he asked the shopkeeper, in a voice he was visibly working to keep level, whether he knew anything of the translator, whether the press that had published the volume kept an address for its authors, anything at all. The shopkeeper, a Mr. Pharaoh the younger, son of the man who had founded the shop and by then running it himself, said that as it happened he did know a little since Miss Vane's translations, for this was, he said, her 3rd such volume in 5 years, each one better received in the small circles that cared for such things than the last, were something of a point of pride for the small press that produced them. A modest scholarly house near Bloomsbury that had built a quiet but genuine reputation on exactly the kind of careful, well-annotated translation work she supplied. He believed, though he could not swear to it, that Miss Vane herself kept rooms not far from the press, and did a certain amount of translation work directly for private clients and publishers besides her books, having built something of a name for reliability and quality among London's small community of literary men who required foreign correspondence, handled with discretion and skill. I watched my old friend absorb this information, the way a man absorbs news of a battle he thought was long over, only to learn it is still, in some quarter, being fought. He asked, quite carefully, whether Mr. Farrow might know the precise address, and Mr. Farrow, sensing perhaps that this was a matter of some private weight to a customer he did not otherwise know from any duke, said he did not have it to hand, but that a note left at the press near Bloomsbury would very likely find her, as she called there regularly. We left the shop without the luncheon we had planned, Gerard carrying the green volume under his arm as though it might be taken from him, and it was in the hackney back toward his club, when he finally spoke again, that I understood the full weight of what 11 years of silence had done to him. He said, and I remember the words almost exactly because I had never before heard him speak of the matter with so little of his usual reserve, that he had told himself for a decade that if he ever found her again, he would know exactly what to say, that he had rehearsed some version of an apology so many times in his own mind that it ought by now to come easily. And yet, he said, sitting in that carriage with her book on his knee, he found he did not know a single word of it, because every word he had ever rehearsed had been built around imagining her still as she had been the night he wronged her, a young secretary in a borrowed room, dependent on his good opinion for her bread. And what he held in his hands now was proof that she had needed none of his good opinion at all, that she had gone out into the world and built, entirely by her own labor and without 1 shilling or 1 kindness from him, a name that would outlast his own in the one circle of London that valued this kind of work above rank or fortune. He said he did not know how a man apologizes to a woman who has, in every way that mattered, already answered the wrong done to her by making herself magnificent without him. I told him, because someone needed to, that this was rather the point, and that if he went to her now expecting to be forgiven for restoring something to her, he would find there was nothing of hers left for him to restore. She did not need his patronage. She did not need his name. If he had anything to offer her at all, it would have to be humility, plainly given, with no accounting attached, and the rest would be entirely her choice to grant or withhold. He was quiet a long while after that. Then he asked whether I would go with him to the press near Bloomsbury. Not, I think, because he needed the company for courage exactly, though perhaps a little of that too, but because he wanted a witness who was not himself, someone who could tell him afterward honestly whether he had conducted himself as a man ought, or whether the old temper and the old pride had crept back in despite his best intentions. I told him I would go. We went 2 days later, having first sent a note to the press asking only whether Miss Vane might receive a caller on a matter unrelated to any commission, a note that gave no name beyond his initials, for he said, with a wryness that was new in him, that he did not wish her first knowledge of the approach to be the ducal seal, as though rank itself might compel an answer that her own judgment would not freely give. She answered that she would receive the caller on Thursday at 11, at her own rooms above the press, which she used as much for her work as for her lodging, and so it was on a bright Thursday morning that Gerard Ashworth, 9th Duke of Hollowmere, climbed a narrow flight of stairs above a Bloomsbury bookseller's, with his heart, I am quite certain, beating harder than it had at any moment in the whole of the financial crisis 11 years before. I will tell you what I saw because I was there, standing a half step behind him on the landing, and because I think what happened in that room deserves to be set down exactly, without softening on either side. She opened the door herself. She was then some 33 years of age, and the years had given her nothing but a settled, confident grace that I do not think she had possessed, for all her competence, as the anxious young secretary she must once have been. She wore a plain dark blue gown, well made but without ornament, ink faintly staining one finger in a way that spoke of a morning already spent at her desk. And behind her, through the open door, I could see a room lined with books and papers in an orderly scholar's clutter. A good window letting in the morning light across a broad writing table covered in proofs and correspondence in 3 or 4 languages at once. It was, in every particular, a room that belonged entirely to her, built by her, answering to no one's ledger but her own. She looked at Gerard for a long moment, and I saw in her face not shock exactly, for I think some part of her had perhaps always understood that London was not so large a city that their paths might not cross again someday, but a kind of careful stillness, the look of a person deciding, in the space of a breath, how much of herself she intends to allow into a conversation before she has heard a single word of what it will contain. She said quite steadily that she had wondered when the note came without a name, whether it might be him. He did not, to his credit, attempt any pleasantry, any comment on the weather or the pleasant situation of her rooms, the sort of small talk a lesser man might have hidden behind. He said, standing there on her own landing in her own light, that he had come to beg her pardon, not for form's sake, and not because 11 years of silence had grown heavy on his conscience, though they had, but because he owed her the truth of what had happened after she left, and because he had no right to expect anything from her beyond permission to say it. He told her then, standing in that doorway with a directness I had rarely seen in him even in our closest confidences, the whole of it of red sabotage, discovered 3 weeks too late, of the letter that came back to him unopened, of the years of quiet inquiry that led nowhere, of the rule he had made in his own household that no servant should ever again be condemned unheard, a rule built, he said, entirely upon the shape of the mistake he had made with her. He said that he did not come to ask her to return to any position in his household, for he understood, holding her own book as he still was under one arm, that she had built something far beyond what Hollowmere could ever have offered her, and that he was, in fact, rather in awe of it and of her. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting, which I think cost her some effort, for I could see in the set of her shoulders that 11 years had not entirely worn away the memory of the last time he had spoken to her at length without pause. When he had finished, she was quiet a moment, and then she asked, in a voice that held no triumph in it, only a plain wish to understand, whether he had read her working translation, the one she had offered him that night, at any point in the 11 years since. He said that he had not, because it no longer existed to be read. It had been filed, forgotten, and lost in the general disorder of the years, and that this, too, was a fault he could not undo, only confess. She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had long suspected rather than wounding her freshly, and said that she had thought of that evening a great many times herself, not always with anger, for anger, she found, was tiring to carry over 11 years, and she had wanted her strength for better uses, but with a kind of settled sorrow that a man she had served faithfully for 6 years had found it so easy to believe the worst of her the one time it mattered, and had not thought her worth even the 3 minutes it would have taken to look at the proof in her own hand. He said, and here his voice, which had been steady through the whole recitation of his failures, caught in a way I had not heard from him since we were boys, that she was right to hold that against him, that it was the truest and worst thing about that night, worse even than the words he had used, because a man who will not look at the evidence in front of him has already decided the verdict before the trial, and that he had spent 11 years learning, slowly and at some cost to his own pride, to look first and judge after, and that he owed the whole of that lesson to her, though it had come to him far too late to spare her anything. I confess I stood on that landing feeling rather as though I ought not to be present at all, but neither of them seemed to remember I was there, and I did not like to break the moment by announcing my own discomfort. She asked him then why he had come now after so long, when he might easily have gone on not knowing where she was and let the whole matter rest as a private regret, which would have cost him nothing further. He held up the green volume still under his arm and said that he had not come looking for her at all that day, that he had walked into a shop for no reason but to keep an old friend company, and had picked up a book by pure accident and read her name on the title page, and that it had struck him, standing in that shop, that he had spent 11 years imagining he owed her an apology for what he had taken from her, when the truth the book put in front of him was that she had not needed him to give anything back. She had simply gone and built it herself, and that this fact, rather than easing his conscience, had made him understand for the first time how much larger the wrong had been than he had ever let himself measure. He had wronged not merely a secretary who might someday need his good word to find other work, he said, but a scholar and a translator of real and lasting gift, whom he had kept for 6 years in a small room off his library doing invisible work under another name, when she might have been doing exactly this room, this light, this shelf of her own books, a decade sooner, had he only had the wit to see what she was and say so plainly while she still worked for him. She was silent a long moment at that, and I saw something move in her face that had not been there before, not quite a softening, for she was too composed a woman to unravel all at once before a man who had once spoken to her so cruelly, but a kind of careful reconsideration, as though she were weighing whether the man in front of her now was in fact the same man who had stood in that library 11 years before, or someone the years had actually altered. She said at last that she would not pretend the years had been easy ones, particularly the first, when she had lived on very little and taken in translation work of every unglamorous kind, contracts and shipping manifests. And once, she said with the ghost of a smile, an entire volume of instructions for the operation of a Belgian thrashing machine, before her name began to mean anything to anyone in the small world of London publishing. But she said, too, that she would not wish those years away now, because they had taught her what she was capable of when no one's ledger stood between her work and her own name, and she was not certain she would have learned it any other way, even had he treated her with perfect justice from the first day to the last. He said that this was, of all the things she might have told him, the one that gave him the least comfort and the most respect for her, because it meant she had made something extraordinary out of an injury he had caused, without his help and very much in spite of him, and that he did not know how a man properly thanked a woman for turning his worst failing into the making of her own fortune, except perhaps by never again failing anyone else in the same way, which he had at least tried to do. There was a pause then, a long one, in which neither of them spoke, and I remember the light through her window falling across the writing table between them, across the proofs and the ink-stained papers that were entirely her own domain now, built without his help, needing nothing further from him to be complete. And I remember thinking, watching the two of them regard each other across that small space, that whatever came next between them would have to be built on exactly the same terms as the room around her, freely, without obligation, without any ledger of debts owed on either side. She asked him, finally, whether he had come only to apologize, or whether there was some further purpose to the visit, and I heard in the question not suspicion but a kind of honest curiosity, the question of a woman who had learned to ask plainly for what she wished to know rather than guess at a man's meaning and be wrong. He answered, with more care than I had ever heard him use in any negotiation of business in all our years of friendship, that he had come only to apologize in truth, and that he had made himself no promise of anything beyond that, because he did not believe he had earned the right to ask for more, not that day, and perhaps not for a good while yet, if ever. But he said that if she would permit it, he would like, in whatever small way she found tolerable, to know her again, not the secretary who had once translated his letters, for that woman had never truly been known to him at all. He saw that now, but the translator and scholar standing in front of him, on her own ground, under her own name, if she would allow a man who had once wronged her so completely the chance to learn who she actually was. She considered this for what felt to me a very long time, though I do not think it was more than a minute, and then she said that she thought she could allow that much, provided he understood it came with no promise attached beyond the visit itself, and provided he came to her rooms as a guest and not as a duke, which she said with the smallest and driest note of humor I had yet heard from her, as though testing whether he could bear to be teased a little, now that the worst of the confession was behind them. He said that he thought he could manage that, and something in his face when he said it was so unlike the harsh and frightened man who had once stood in his own library and condemned her unheard that I found myself, standing forgotten on the landing, unexpectedly moved, in the way an old friend is moved to see another man finally become, at considerable cost to his pride, someone worth the years of waiting. That was, in truth, the beginning rather than the end of it, and I will not pretend to you that everything resolved itself in a single conversation on a Bloomsbury landing, because it did not, and it would have been false to her dignity and to his hard-won humility alike to make it seem so easy. He called on her again the following week, and the week after that, always as a guest, always in the daylight hours proper to such a call, always careful never to let the shadow of his rank fall across her own work or her own judgment of when and how she wished to receive him. He asked her opinion on matters of translation and scholarship, as though she were the authority in the room, which she was. He brought her, on his second visit, not gifts of the ordinary courting kind, but a set of Italian pamphlets he had come across in a bookseller's that he thought might interest her scholarly work, a gesture so precisely suited to what she valued, rather than to what convention expected a duke to offer a lady, that I think it did more to move her than any jewel could have done. Over the better part of a year, in the careful, dignified way of two people who had once been badly wounded by haste and had no wish to repeat the error, they built something neither of them named aloud for a long while. I was present at enough of those visits, in my role as the old friend who had first stood beside him in the bookshop, and seemed, by some unspoken agreement, to have earned a standing invitation to witness what followed, that I can tell you it was not swift, and it was not showy, and it was entirely to her credit and to his. I recall one particular afternoon, perhaps 8 months after that first visit, when I called at her rooms to find Gerard already there. The two of them bent together over a difficult passage in a Spanish manuscript she had been engaged to translate for a private collector. His head inclined toward hers over the page, close enough that I saw his hand rest, for just a moment, near hers on the table's edge, not quite touching, and saw her not draw away from it, and saw the color rise very slightly in her face before she returned, with great and deliberate composure, to the line of Spanish before them. Neither of them remarked on it. I did not remark on it either, though I confess I found some excuse to leave them to their work rather sooner than I had planned, feeling, not for the first time in that year, that I was witnessing something too carefully tended to bear an audience. It was in the spring following, some 14 months after the day in Pharaoh's shop, that Gerard came to me not to ask my blessing, for he needed no man's blessing to do as he pleased, but because, he said, he wished to tell someone who had watched the whole of it unfold before he told anyone else, and said that he had asked her, at last, whether she would consent to be his wife, not his duchess first and his wife after, he was careful to say, but the reverse, and that she had told him she would think on it, which he said with a laugh I had not heard from him in years, because he understood now that a woman who had built an entire independent life rather than wait on any man's favor, was not a woman who would be rushed into an answer merely because a duke had asked the question. She gave her answer 3 weeks later in her own rooms on her own terms, and what she said to him then was told to me only in part. For some things even an old friend is not owed the whole of, but I know this much, that she told him she would marry him not because he was a duke, which she had never once in all their acquaintance seemed to hold as any particular recommendation, and not because 11 years had earned him any right to her. For she did not believe hurt could be redeemed merely by the passage of time, but because she had watched him, over the better part of a year, become in fact the man his rule about hearing servants before judging them had only promised on paper, and because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wished to spend the remainder of her days in the company of a man who had learned, at real cost to himself, to look before he condemned. She did not give up her work. I want to set that down plainly, because it was, in the end, the thing she cared most that the world should understand about the marriage that followed. She continued to translate, continued to publish under her own name, continued to keep her rooms above the Bloomsbury press for her own use even after she became, in the eyes of society, the Duchess of Hollowmere, and Gerard, who had once believed it beneath his notice to credit her work at all, was known in his later years to speak of his wife's scholarship to anyone who would listen with a pride so evident that more than one dowager remarked, with some astonishment, that the stark Duke had gone soft in his old age, not understanding that what they were seeing was not softness at all, but a man who had finally learned, at great cost, the plain difference between a temper indulged and a debt honestly paid. I stood as witness at their wedding, as I had stood as witness on that Bloomsbury landing, and I will confess to you now, as an old man looking back on the whole of it, that I have seen a great many marriages made for property, for family alliance, for every reason but the one that ought to matter most, and I have rarely seen one built on a foundation so honestly laid as theirs. A foundation of a wrong fully confessed, a dignity that never once bent to ask for what it was not freely given. And a man who learned, far too late for it to cost him nothing, that the woman he had once dismissed in a moment of temper had never needed his forgiveness to become magnificent, and could only be won in the end by his.